Now, let's begin our next segment of our event with second keynote session. Professor Shihui Feng will chair this session. Everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Shihui Feng.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second keynote today. So today, the second keynote titled Human AI Collaboration in Education, the Hybrid Future, will tap on the exciting frontiers of AI education. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Inge MOLENAAR to everybody. Professor Inge MOLENAAR is the director of the National Education Lab AI and a professor of education and artificial intelligence at Radboud University. With over 20 years of experience in technology-enhanced learning, she has successfully navigated roles ranging from entrepreneur to academic. She is a recipient of several prestigious grants, including an ERC starting grant and a funding for the National AI and Education Lab. Professor MOLENAAR's research focuses on innovative, technology-empowered approach to optimize human learning and teaching. Central to her work is the application of data, learning analytics, and artificial intelligence to understand the dynamics of learning over time. Envisioning hybrid human-AI learning technologies, Professor MOLENAAR aims to augment human intelligence with artificial intelligence, empowering both learners and educators to make education more efficient, effective, and responsive to individual needs. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor MOLENAAR.
And good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Perfect. So how is your after lunch dip? I just had the most amazing lunch. So thank you very much for the invitation, Nancy. It's great to be here and very happy to be here to deliver this talk. Just very quickly, who of you is teaching in primary or secondary education? Can I see some hands? Yeah, I saw some of you already present earlier today. Great. And who's teaching at the university? Almost all of us. Perfect. Well, welcome. I'm glad to hear that you're also educators apart from researchers, because I think that's really important. I'll be talking to you today, this works, about human AI collaboration and simplifying the hybrid future. And I do this from the work that I do as a psychologist, so a social scientist in background, but also as somebody who has been working with education for the last 20 years, very much so with K-12 teachers. So I'm very much engaged in the educational community, and we always try to work with teachers in designing and actually developing our AI solutions. So I'll be emphasizing that quite a bit today during this talk as well. But before I start, I have a little teaser for you. Now, who knows, how are we recognizing AI these days? Anybody? Well, how did we used to do it before? We used to have the Turing tests. And a Turing test would help us signify if you could actually recognize the human or whether it would be a machine. Now, I think we can all agree that we finally passed most of the Turing tests with generative AI. But it leaves us with another question. How are we recognizing AIs today? And this is just a little teaser to think about that. Let's see if this is working like this.
Tyfus. Ik kom er niet doorheen.
Heeft u de pagina al eens ververst?
Ja, een paar keer.
Wat is er, liefje?
En als u alles wegklikt en de boel weer even opnieuw opstart?
Ja, ook al gedaan.
Maar u komt er niet doorheen?
Nee, daarom bel ik. Hallo?
Ja, ik begrijp dat dit misschien een beetje een persoonlijke vraag is, maar zou het eventueel ook zo kunnen zijn dat u ja, ook echt een robot bent, zeg maar?
Nou, nee.
Laten we eerst even gaan zitten.
Dat weet u zeker?
Ik ben geen robot.
So this as a teaser, how and when do we still know whether we are talking or actually being an AI, or when we are in fact still human? And this was actually the Dutch sent-in short movie to the Oscars. And it actually won an award. So as a Dutch person, I'm also quite proud of this trailer. But I think it raises an important question because it really asks us about how are we recognizing AIs and what does it mean? Where is the line between human and AI technology, and how are we going to be able to recognize the line? And how far is that symbiosis that Roger was talking about this morning actually going to take place? And what does it mean for us as humans? And I think especially in education, that is a really important question, because education is a process that we clearly design. We decide how students learn, when they learn, and what they're learning. And so educational design is an instructional process. It's a designing process. And AI is going to play an important role in our educational system. It already does that today, and it will increasingly do that over the next decades. Now, the question is, how are we going to design this AI? And how are we designing this human-AI collaboration to optimize our human learning? And I think that is an important question that we're addressing today. And about 20 years ago, the internet just started when I came from grad school. And so I lived through the development of the internet and how we went from learning management systems to social media to all the applications that are so familiar for you today. And I think we are somewhat in a similar space right now. AI is just starting to evolve. It's still very unclear how we're going to be using it in our educational systems across time. But now is the time to think about this very carefully, because decisions that we're making today are going to be extremely fundamental in the way that we're using this technology throughout our developmental processes. So that's also why at the National AI and Education Center in the Netherlands, we're very much looking into developing innovative practices together with teachers to make sure that the voice of educational professionals is really connected into the development of artificial intelligence for primary and secondary education. And that's what I'll be talking about today. Educational AI is something that we develop. And we also think about AI as a systems technology, a technology that will have similar impact on our society as, for instance, the steam engine, electricity, and the computer. And I think that space is something that we recognize a lot, especially since the introduction of generative AI about 2 years ago. There's a big distinction between AI, generic AI, that is going to change our societies, and generative AI as being one of the forms of generic AI, and actual educational AI. And educational AI is profoundly developed and designed to be used in education. And I think sometimes we forget the distinction. So AI is a fantastic tool and we can do fantastic things with it. But at the same time, when we start applying it in educational context, we need to think very carefully about how we're designing it and how we're implementing it within our classrooms. And that's very much what this talk is all about. So I'll be talking about a number of ways that we're using artificial intelligence in education. And the first part is really about understanding learning and teaching with artificial intelligence. And I think that is a part that is often forgotten. AI helps us to understand at a much more granularity level how students are learning and how we are teaching our students. And by doing that, it allows us to understand our own learning and teaching processes much better and to really start using it in a profound manner. And that's what part 2 is about. It's really about supporting learning and teaching with artificial intelligence. Now, of course, we've been doing this already with technology and with artificial intelligence already over the last 20 years in more rudimentary forms of AI. For instance, rule-based systems, but also intelligent tutoring systems have been around for quite a while already. What is important to note about artificial intelligence usage today is that about half of our student-facing AI that is being used today in classrooms is not based on the knowledge that we have about teaching and learning. And to me, this was quite shocking, because I thought that it was quite natural to think about educational sciences and learning sciences and integrate the knowledge that we have also from psychology into the way that we're using AI for learning and teaching. And this is not the current practice today. So as a community, as universities around the world, this is something that we really need to start emphasizing much more. For teacher-faced AI, which is, by the way, also far less occurrence than student-faced AI, it's even worse. It's only about 1/3 of the solutions that you'll find in classrooms today are informed by our knowledge about how teachers are teaching in classrooms. And we know about these things, so we can really integrate the knowledge about teaching much better in the AI solutions. So there is a large gap between what we know about teaching and learning and what we're integrating in AI solutions today. And I really call to us as a community to start closing that gap and use the knowledge that we have for this. So I'll be talking a little bit more about how we can do that in part 2. Then in part 3, I'd like to discuss a little bit more of how we're designing learning and teaching with artificial intelligence. What does that mean exactly? And what I think is really interesting are the results from these OECD studies that have been done about 2 years ago. And what they did, they asked economic scientists to think about all the tasks that constitute professions. And think about which of those tasks in a particular profession could be replaced by the state-of-the-art AI as we know it today. And so that gave us, for a lot of professions, I'll show this one first, a lot of different professions, which tasks can in fact be replaced by AI and which tasks will always be profoundly human. And what is interesting, educational instruction and library services, you have to give them some credit. These people are economists. They don't really always distinguish education as a field in itself. It's all the way at the end. And what does that mean? That means that education has a relatively high amount of bottleneck items. And these are items that will not be replaced by AI, according to the experts. And it has a very low percentage of automatable items. So the amount of tasks that we can really fully automate with an AI is only 6%. But it leaves us with a large space. So that was not the idea. If this is not back, then this definitely is. So that leaves us with 22% of things that will never be changed, 6% automatable, 72% space where AI and humans in some way can work together to solve tasks and to execute tasks in teaching. So that means this is a profession compared to the professions on this side of the schema, where AI and humans will collaborate together quite extensively. And there's a lot of space to do that. So it's very important for us as a community to start understanding how to do that in a profound manner. And in fact, we don't know that much about it yet. So in some ways, you want to be in production or in farming and fishery, because there the amount of automation is much higher. So the pressure on human AI collaboration will be much lower. So I think it's really important for us as a community to start understanding that a lot of the tasks in education will become dual tasks. Now, human and AI collaboration is in fact difficult. And we don't really know that much about human AI collaboration in education yet, but across other domains we do. And these are the results from a study that was published in Nature and Human Behavior just this year. And it shows us that across studies where AI performance can be compared with human performance, it's very difficult to have, in fact, symbiosis, what Roger was talking about this morning. They call it synergy. So these researchers were really interested in seeing if we have an AI that can do a task or a human that can do a task, what happens if we have them work together and do together they perform better than either the AI or the human. Now, most studies, and that's what we see here, most studies, 213, either the AI or the human alone does better. And in fact, most of the time, if the AI outperforms the human, the AI performs better in these tasks. In 157 studies, we found that a human AI collaboration was performing better together. So it is possible, but it's definitely not the majority of the studies that they looked at. Now, if we look at human AI augmentation, and this is situations where the AI is not outperforming the human yet, or at all, and where human AI together perform better than just a human alone. And there you see that the majority of the studies is in fact showing that a human plus an AI can do better than an AI or a human alone. So in that sense, it's interesting to see augmentation is a system that we do understand to some extent, but synergy seems to be something that we still find very difficult to design for and to develop. And I think that aligns with our current understanding of how to create human AI systems. So in the end of this talk, I'll try to talk a little bit more about this. One important thing about all these studies that were in this meta review, none of them were in education. So these were all studies in either business processing or medicine. So it's important to note that this paradigm that has been used a lot around other application domains has not been applied in education. So I think if you take anything from this, take it as a challenge. See if we can do this as well in education and start understanding when and how human and AI are doing better together than one of them alone. All right, let's turn to part one. Understanding learning and teaching with artificial intelligence. I think it's interesting to see that actually AI and psychology and cognitive psychology, as outlined by the introduction this morning, have a very close connection. They're actually coming from the same grounds. So AI has been out there to make machines simulate human cognition in order to learn more about human cognition originally, not so much in order to have machines learn. This is something that came out later. So it's interesting to see that psychology and artificial intelligence really share a fundamental common ground. And this understanding helps us to also start understanding our learning processes in much more detail than we ever did before. So apart from the black box from AI, we're also opening up the black box of learning in order to see how students are in fact learning. And I'll give you one example that's very much aligned to the work that I've been working on, but also Roger was presenting on this morning. So it's very important that we use a theoretical lens to understand learning processes. And we do that through a variety of learning theoretical models. And one that I tend to work with a lot is the COPES model from Winnie and Hadwin. We visualize it slightly different than the original model, but it's still the same model with different phases about setting definitions of a task, setting goals, enacting those goals in actually executing with an important monitoring and control loop, and then making adaptations to your own learning process. And this theoretical lens helps us understand how learners go to different learning processes. And it also helps us to understand how we can measure learning processes in more detail. And Roger also talked about it this morning in these instrumented classrooms where we have all these different data streams coming together to measure how students are in fact processing through this learning activity. And with that, and I think you heard a little bit, for those people who were here last year, heard Dragon talk about this as well, because this is our Flora engine. And so what we do in the Flora engine is really trying to understand at a very detailed level how students are going through self-regulatory processes. So which cognitive, metacognitive processes students engage in while they're, in this example, writing an essay. And it's important because today we don't know if essays that are being written are in fact written by our students or are written by a generative AI. And with this tool really helps us to give an idea of how students are going through all these cognitive and metacognitive processes and how these processes are then influencing the quality of their writing and the way that they are constructing language. And so it really helps us at a very fine-grained, detailed level to understand how students go through the cognitive orientation and planning processes, reading processes, writing processes, monitoring processes, and continue onwards. And what is the fascinating thing, also when I talk to teachers about this, we're using this in secondary schools. And so a lot of secondary school students are writing with the Flora engine and can actually really see how they went through their writing processes. And every student has a unique process. And in fact, you wouldn't believe how different these writing processes are. And most of our teachers were very surprised about seeing the differences, but also the students. They really expect everybody to follow the same writing process. And this is just not the case. Everybody has a different barcode, we tend to call it, and it really looks profoundly different. So we have created profiles of students on how they go through these different processes in order to make them understand and also really give them a vocabulary to talk about regulating your own writing processes and understanding what you're doing. So AI in this particular example really helps us to open up this black box of learning and understand at a very granular level how students are going through writing processes, how they're monitoring and controlling their own learning activities. And that's also something we've shown in a grid that Roger and I have been working on as well, which is the SME grid, self-regulated learning multimodal learning analysis. It has all these different input data here on this X, and it has the CAM processes, which you also heard about this morning: cognition, metacognition, affective states, and motivation. And it has multiple ways of analyzing this. We can do it in a unimodal approach, really using one CAM process and one data stream, but you can also do it in horizontal, multiple CAM processes, vertical, multiple data processes, or integrated approaches where you do multiple data streams with multiple processes. And what we see in the research field over the last 5 years is that there is an increase in these integrated methods. So increasingly, we're using multiple data streams together to actually detect multiple processes and understand at a much more detailed level how students are learning. And in this space, you see again the Flora engine, which I already talked about, and also the work that Roger talked about this morning in MetaTutor, which is also an integrated approach to analyzing data. Now, if you see, we also see a switch in analytic approaches. So we really see that over the last decade or so, we went from mostly unimodal approaches to mostly integrated approaches when we're looking at understanding data and analyzing self-regulated learning. So there's really a transition in the analytic approaches as a field that we're taking part of. What is interesting, we are using AI in all of these integrated approaches, but not to the extent that we really could be using it. So there's lots of space still to improve the usage of AI to understand learning processes. And I really think that that is one of the things we should pay more attention to. Now let's turn to the part 2, where we talk about supporting learning and teaching with artificial intelligence. And this is really about closing the loop, as we call it in the learning analytics community. It's really about using what we've learned in part 1 about learning processes to really start supporting learners with artificial intelligence or teachers. Now, roughly in the literature, you see 2 types of AI. One is the learner-faced AI with solutions like intelligent tutoring systems, adaptive systems, agents that we talked about this morning already, and teacher-faced AI, where you have solutions like helping them with lesson plans, providing feedback, dashboards, but also, for instance, broadening software to help you see if students are in fact working themselves. There is a lot more learner-faced AI than teacher-faced AI. So this is definitely a space where we can still create a lot of opportunities. Now, if we really want to connect AI to the knowledge that we create, we can do that in a number of different ways. And I work back to the example that I just gave. So the example from the Flora engine gives us a lot of detailed information on how students regulate their learning. Now, what we often do is provide that information back to students in the form of dashboards. And so what you see in this example here on the left is an example of AI informing learners and teachers. And here you see two different essays. So you see two of the barcodes that I just already indicated. And what we had students do here is write essay 1, provide them with information about how they regulated their writing process, and then set goals for changing that writing process. So what do I want to do better? And then actually do that again. And then you can actually see whether or not you obtained these goals, whether you actually changed your writing process and your writing product. So this is one way of supporting students with artificial intelligence. Another way is actually, this is interesting. You have to promise me on this. This is a scaffold, and it helps students to actually trigger particular SRL processes while they are writing. So next to informing them about how they're writing right now or how they write it in the previous exercise, we can always, during writing, trigger particular SRL processes. So if we, for instance, see that students are not introducing them into reading the introduction or not planning enough, not monitoring their writing behavior, we can cue that type of behavior. And we already did this for decades, but now we actually have the in-depth information of how they are doing these processes, so we can actually inform the scaffolding on the information that we already have about the student. So if you have been planning enough as a student, I'm not going to give you this scaffold because you already did it. But if you didn't do it, the system is going to help you do those particular activities. And then, of course, finally, we'd like to go, and we're actually experimenting with this. So we'd like to go to this particular example here, where the students can also, in fact, interrogate their own data and discuss with an artificial agent about how they are actually doing this writing experience and ask questions about their own process, trying to understand it in more detail. So that is one of the things that we're currently developing. So you see the role of AI in informing, acting, and potentially interacting with humans. And that brings me to the double role that AI has in education. And that double role is really creating understanding and synergy in the data, merging the data together, diagnosing the data, in this case for SRL, because that's what we're interested in, and then either informing or acting towards the students. And then, of course, moving forward. And that double role is important because it really tells us that AI helps us to understand and helps us to support. I think that is something that we tend to forget. I'm going to give you a few more examples on how to integrate this with our theoretical understanding. So what is really important is integrating the functioning of the AI with the knowledge that we have about teaching and learning. So I already gave you the example of the COPES model that we use. And then if we're using the Flora engine to inform students, you'll see that they have different elements in the LMS system that helps students to do particular activities over time. And then the AI interacts with the student, but just with providing them information. So not so much by taking over roles, but really giving them additional information to work with. If we're moving, if we're moving into this in more depth, you can really see how students can relate their product goals. So the goals about their writing, the structure, the relevance, and the main points that they need to address in their essays, whether or not they obtain those goals, and then how different writing processes are connected to that. And so, for instance, here we have the structure being activated. The student can see when they worked on different topics and when they completed the sub-goal. And then they can actually see which of these metacognitive and cognitive processes were around that. So you can actually have a discussion with your students about what is your structure? When did you work on your structure while you were writing? And what does that mean for the integration in your essay? And sorry for some of the Dutch in this picture. A similar example from another project. So Flora is about essay writing. We also do a lot of projects with adaptive learning technologies where students learn math and grammar in adaptive technologies. So they practice their math on computer programs. And with that, they're often being directed by the system themselves. But also in those situations, it's super important for students to be engaged in their own learning processes. So also within that, this is for primary school students, we've developed a system where they actually set their goals, see how their progress is being made by actually seeing how well they are processing towards their goals, and providing them with information about the trajectories, how they've learned over time. And these are not as detailed as the ones as I just showed you. They're more generic overviews for children to understand whether they went to their goal in a straight line or whether they did a lot of iterations going through that activity. Now in this one, again, the AI has an informing role. The moment we start allowing the children to interact with the AI, they can actually change their curves and also indicate at which difficulty level they like to work. And in that way, they actually gain control over their own monitoring activities and thereby changing the regulation together with the artificial intelligence. And here you really start to understand how an AI together with a human child can regulate the learning activity. In the dashboarding for the students, we make that a little bit more explicit even. So we have that learning curve again, which shows how you were learning and how you were progressing towards your goal. And of course, the adaptive learning technology makes it easier or harder for you already. So when you make a mistake, it becomes a little bit easier. When you do it correct, it becomes a little bit harder. That's how most technologies work. So this is what we visualize here in showing what the AI is actually doing for you. And then this is where you can choose what you want to do together. So do you want to make it harder together? Do you want to make it easier together? And this is what you can do as a learner yourself. And by really making that extremely explicit, like what is the AI doing for you? What can you do together? And what do you have to do yourself? Because the AI cannot do that for you. We're really sort of trying to disentangle how human and AI regulation can work together. And we've been testing this with children in primary schools, age 10. You'll be amazed how quickly they got this. They really thought it was so easy to navigate, and they actually really enjoyed working with this extra addition to the system. And in an ideal world, and we're still developing on this, we're building different levels of external regulation, so regulation by the artificial intelligence, and self-regulated learning, regulation by the learner, and in between activities where the AI and the human learner are in fact regulating together. And ideally, you want students to move from an AI-regulated to a self-regulated system where they actually develop the AI skills to regulate their own learning as they go forward. And with different types of information and different types of actions from the artificial intelligence, we're moving into that direction. And that gives us a bit of an idea of how the functioning of artificial intelligence together with a student is working. It can either work in an informing role towards the student or this acting role towards the student. Now, in most educational situations, this is a little bit more complex because it's not just the student, it's the student, the artificial intelligence, and the teacher. So this next section is really about designing learning and teaching with artificial intelligence. And what does that mean when we start to integrate both of them together? Now, an important thing, and I think we already talked about it a little bit today, is that there are multiple perspectives to thinking about the use of artificial intelligence in education. And one we know very well is the replacement perspective. So we're replacing human activity by artificial intelligence. And the best known example is the self-driving car, where the ultimate goal is to have humans be replaced by the actual car. In education, this is probably not the most logical perspective to work from, because we're not really looking at replacing teachers. And in fact, as I opened it, there's only a small part of the task of a teacher that we can in fact replace by AI. So the augmentation perspective, where we think about AI actually supporting teachers and supplementing teachers' tasks, is probably this perspective that is much more fitting than the replacement perspective. But it really requires us to think about this in a different way and really start thinking about what are the tasks that we like to actually automate. So what are we outsourcing? What are we offloading? And what are the tasks that are critical to human activity in education? So what are the things that as a human teacher, I really want to continue to do in my classroom? And where do I see most value of me as a human as opposed to the AI? And I think that's a question we haven't been thinking about enough. And it's a tough one to crack, because for every single solution I can come up with, I can come up with a full teacher notion, a full AI notion most of the time, and a lot of different levels in between. So what we do at the National AI and Education Center, when we get a question from teachers about a particular AI that they'd like to use, we always make them think through all these different levels. Think about a full AI solution. Now, what would you lose if we start doing that? And think about different layers in between. And we created a model for that. It's the 6-layer of automation model. We actually borrowed it from the automobile industry. So this has been used in the automobile industry quite a bit in the original version. And then people were asking, why does it take so long to actually create a self-driving car? Well, because there are different steps that make it increasingly complex. So in the original model here, we had the human driver alone. There we had the fully self-driving car. And this works quite similar. Here we have the teacher alone. At the end, we have a completely autonomous AI technology for learning. But there is a big difference between the self-driving car and education, because I actually don't think that for the majority of the things that we do in schools, we want to get to the left side of the model. To the right side of the model, sorry guys. I think we want to end up for most of the things that we do somewhere in the middle. And we have to think very carefully about what that middle is and where do we think the AI has an added value. So think back of that part 5 slide that I showed you. Very few examples where AI has synergy with humans, but humans can be augmented with AI. So there's a lot of space for teachers to be helped, assisted by informing them, giving them additional information about what happens in their classrooms, partially taking over tasks. For instance, if we make exercises a little bit more difficult for student 1 and not for student B, that works well. This is something you cannot possibly do as a teacher in your classroom with 30. It just doesn't work. But the AI can do it for you. It works really well. So that's partial automation. Little tasks are being transferred to the AI, which makes you as a teacher more effective. Conditional automation is about a multitude of tasks being transferred to the AI, so a cluster of things. But the teacher still monitors and still takes over human control to make sure that everything is done correctly. High automation actually changes that around. The AI is mostly taking over the tasks of the teacher, but there are some critical tasks the teacher still does better by himself. And then full automation is a fully automated system. So far, most of the systems that we're using are either teacher assistants with dashboards providing additional information to teachers, or partial automation, intelligent tutoring systems, adaptive learning technologies. Some tasks are being taken over. Most of the tasks are being done by the teacher. Conditional automation you see a little bit, but not too many. High, very few, and then full automation, for instance, Duolingo is one of the examples where you really see a fully automated system. So I think when we get questions from teachers, every single time we go through all the different levels and just have them iterate on that. What does it mean? What do you lose? Where do you go? How does that scenario look? And what we found is that most teachers are actually quite okay being replaced with regular tasks and tasks that are relatively easy, but the more complex human interaction tasks are really the tasks that they'd like to maintain. Now, let me give you one example of how we do this. In the National AI and Education Center, this is one of our co-creation projects. We have 30 projects up and running. So if you're interested, come talk to me. I can give lots of other examples. This is a technical reading with automated speech recognition. I think you'll probably have something similar. Teachers in the Netherlands, Dutch is a transparent language, unlike English. So it means that if you know how to verbalize a vowel, the letters, you actually know how to read. So learning to read technically takes roughly about half a year to a year, but it's not a very complex process, but it is a very difficult process to measure, to see how students are actually reading technically. So we have word lists that students have to go through, and that's all individually administrated tasks. And teachers were really asking us, can we please do this more efficiently? But also, can we have more concurrent information about how students are in fact reading? Because right now I only notice every half a year, and that's just not enough to read. So what we started to do is using automated speech recognition to have students work with that in the classrooms, and then give teachers concurrent information about how they're being able to read all these different letters and how well students are being progressing. And that really gives us a nice example of where AI is complementing existing teacher knowledge. So teachers already roughly know how well students are reading because they're observing in the classroom, they know what they're doing, but they don't know the exact detail. And so with this technology, the exact detail on every letter and every letter combination is given to the teachers, which gives them a much better insight in how to support their classrooms and help them with instruction. So if we do it like this, it would be a level 2 teacher assistant project where teachers just get better informed about the development of their students. Now, if we have the AI actually also select new exercises for students to work on based on the assessment of their actual reading practice, we would move to a level 3 project where we actually have partial automation because the AI then helps to select particular activities. Now, if we would also have the AI decide how long a student should work on particular letters or a combination of particular letters, we would actually move to a level 4, because that means that combined activities are being assessed by the AI, and the AI is controlling the actual administration of those activities as well. So for all these different, for the application of ASR for technical reading, you can have different levels of AI involvement, and you can think about which one is acceptable for you as a teacher. And this is the type of dialogues that we're having with our teachers continuously. How far do you want to go? Where do you feel comfortable? And in which way do you want to integrate this into your daily practice? We already had this one. And what you see here is the more complex functioning of the artificial intelligence. You see the functioning of the AI, the informing role towards the teacher, the acting role towards the student at different levels. And in between that, we see the pedagogical and instructional practices of the teacher. And what is the most interesting thing that I think from a research perspective is that once we bring this functioning of AI into a classroom, we actually see a transition of the pedagogical instructional practices of the teachers. So they actually start to use provide different feedback to their students, bring up different lesson plans, work from different instructional or pedagogical models. So in this way, the actual professional development of the teacher and the way that they're integrating pedagogical and instructional models into their classroom practices can be influenced by the way that we're using the artificial intelligence within classrooms. And I think that's the most exciting thing for the transition that we're looking at. And with that, there are actually 3 different processes that we currently see happening in classrooms. We see AI replacing the teacher on an existing task. So we actually see an offloading activity. We don't see many of those, but they do exist. We see complementation. Human AI share an existing task. Most of the time, this happens when teachers are given additional information by the artificial intelligence. And in that way, it complements the current task of the teacher. And then what we also see is that human and AI start sharing a new task together. And this is what I would call augmentation. This is really something that you could not do before, because you could not possibly feasibly manage this in a classroom with 25 students without an AI being in there. But because of the AI, all of a sudden you can do things you couldn't do before. And that's where things really get exciting. And what we often see is that it goes from an initial idea from replacement to some form of complementation. And then if we're in classrooms long enough, we start to see this augmentation process. So what I think is happening most of the time is that we have an evolving interaction between the teacher, the AI, and the student together, moving through these different phases. Now, there isn't that much research on that, so I would all encourage us to do more research on this to start understanding these processes in more detail. And that's the last part that I'd like to talk about. Do we still have time? Yeah, we'll manage. Researching the hybrid future. How are we going to develop those useful combinations of human AI collaboration? And this was the slide that I opened with in the beginning. Very difficult to get synergy, easier to get augmentation, but the assumptions underlying this do not hold up for our field. So I'm going to crash this a little bit, because it assumes that there's a task that an AI can do alone. Well, we saw in the beginning already, only about 6% of the tasks in education AI can in fact do alone. So we probably won't be able to follow this very often in education. So the AI has to do it alone, the human has to do it alone. That means that everything that I put on that far end, on the augmentation level, is not possible within this framework, because then either the human or the AI cannot do it by themselves. They need each other. And you have to be able to do it together. So it's a very interesting study, but it's still relatively restricted for our domain. So the question is, do we have conditions like this in education? If we do, and I think we have a few, we could actually do this type of research, but we have to be aware of the fact that a lot of the time we will not be able to replicate this paradigm in education, simply because the assumptions do not hold up. One place where I think we can do it is grading. There's a lot of AI being used on essay grading and assessment. And the interesting thing is, it is getting good enough to do this. AI by itself, human by itself, human and AI together. So this is really a domain where we can apply this paradigm. I'm super excited to see what we're going to come up with, because it's very tricky. And also from a functional perspective, how do you want the AI to function in that grading interaction? Think about that very carefully, and I can already predict the way that you're going to have the AI inform the human, or the human inform the AI, is going to determine whether you find synergy or augmentation. So it's going to be super interesting to start understanding under which conditions can we do the grading together, and can we actually do it better together. And I think one of the things in all of these application areas where it will not work, the interesting part is doing a task analysis on human AI collaboration. So how are teachers and students actually collaborating with the AI? And I'm just going to give you one very quick example. If we're looking at these adaptive learning technologies, in the Netherlands, they're being used in direct instruction. So here you see the different activities that teachers engage in direct instruction. Direct instruction is started off with activating prior knowledge. Teachers still do that. They still stand in front of their classroom. They still have a dialogue with their students, but they now know their prior knowledge of the students beforehand, because they're giving this information in the dashboard. So you're having a totally different dialogue than if you're standing there just off the record. So there the AI complements. Then discussion of learning goals still goes on, providing of instructions, still majority done by teachers. We replaced them for a while, we stopped doing that, didn't work so well. Then we went on to guided practice. This is where students start practicing an individual practice, and this is where you see the partial replacement hidden. So assignment of problems, much better done by an AI. Direct feedback, AI can perfectly do that. Elaborate feedback, sometimes yes, sometimes no. most of the time, teachers do better. So this is also one of those spaces where it's super interesting to start looking at, okay, what in feedback the AI can actually do, and where do we really want to have this human teacher step in? And what is the type of feedback that human teachers give versus the AI? We already know human teachers give different feedback. Their allocation is different. The task, the way they look at the task is different as well. So feedback totally changes. So this is, again, a form of augmentation because you're adding in the information from the technology. Teachers know exactly what students are doing wrong. And you're adding in the partial replacement, and then the functioning of the teacher in the classroom just changes into giving different students feedback and different types of feedback. And I think that's, again, what we're looking at. How are we changing this situation? So we really want to understand these useful combinations of human and AI collaboration. And then the bummer of this is, once you go into a classroom once, you can see it. It's different across multiple classrooms. And trust me, teachers evolve. They're actually learning from the AI because the AI is feeding back information about the development of their classroom and their students continuously. So they understand to a much greater detail how their class is developing. And that means that the AI and the human are co-evolving. There's one trouble here. It's a one-sided co-evolvement. The AI does not currently learn from the teacher yet. There are very, very few AIs that learn from us. And I know that everybody thinks a generative AI is learning from you, and in fact, it doesn't. It learns from all of us, but it doesn't learn from you as a teacher. So it's very important to realize that the human is evolving because of the AI. Now, how do we get to an AI that is actually evolving because of me as a teacher? Not because of all of us as teachers, because that it can do, but me as a teacher. How does it know about how I teach, what I find important, what my students know, and what it doesn't know? Because teachers still know a lot more about their children in their classroom than an AI does. So how are we actually going to optimize that situation? I think that's one of the biggest questions that we're looking at today. To wrap up, we're doing that, this work and all the other work in the National AI and Education Center. We have a large co-creation program where we develop new innovation solutions of AI together with education. So teachers are always our starting point. Science, we find scientists that can actually implement theories on learning and teaching. And we find businesses to work with us. And in that triangle, we develop new innovative solutions. We have 30 going. We do 10 new ones every year. So we're going to end up with around 80 new AI solutions for education. And this is for K-12. We also have our scientific program. And in there, we have this interdisciplinary scientific activity, both with the pedagogical, didactical people. So really about how are people learning, professional development, how are people teaching, sustainable data. How are we going to make this sustainable? Which AIs are we using? And what does that mean for energy? AI technology, which types of AI are best fitted for which types of solutions and innovations? And we have an embedded ethics program. We have an ethical guidelines for AI in education already from the EU and from the Netherlands itself, but that doesn't mean that a guideline helps you to do this day-to-day in the classroom. So we have our embedded ethicists coming in on our projects and really work together with the teams of teachers in developing these AIs in order to answer the questions that they have. So there's a continuous recrossing of how we're changing values and needs. We also work together in the Center for Learning and Living with AI, among others with Roger, with those of you who were here last year with Sana and Dragan, really thinking about what it means to teach students to self-regulate in an age of AI. And we have a website on this, so feel free to ask me questions later. And then in the new European project, we're working on a new model for teacher AI complementarity. And we do this with a bunch of centers across Europe to really start thinking about what it means to have humans and AI work together, both at the task level, which I talked about quite a bit today, but also how that lingers into the skill level, the job level. So what does that mean for the profession? What is a teacher going to be like 10 years from now, 15 years from now? And how does that interact with all these different other components? So human AI collaboration, I think we're just starting to explore and understand what it means. I think really understanding when we're replacing, complementing, and how we can augment in education is one of the big challenges that we're looking into. And I talked about how we know increasingly more about learning and teaching in part one, how we need to connect that into supporting it as AI is still under development, and how we can improve our scientific knowledge and the connection with that, with the AI, and how we should focus more on designing and complementing augmentation with teachers and better understanding the human AI level interaction from this perspective. And we're not doing this alone. In the middle is the National AI and Education Center. Sella is over there. This is my own lab, and this is the Tycho team. So we have a lot of people being in the loop when working on this with us together, and of course, lots of funders that make this possible. Thank you so much for your attention.
So thanks again for Professor MOLENAAR, this wonderful, inspiring, informative keynote. So given the time, we may just have time to take one question. And then Professor MOLENAAR will stay here, and you can also approach her after the session to have more questions. Just one question, anyone?
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you for your talking first. So you mentioned before have the 6 layers of automation model. So my question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge in the future? Is about education domain problem or technical problem? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. The original model was actually coming from a technological perspective. So the automobile industry was struggling with actually technological challenges. And in the original paper that I did on the model, which is the Digital Education Outlook for the OECD in 2021, you'll see that there's a strong focus on the technical limitations of the model. So that was the initial take. And there I argue that we have a problem at the detection level because we cannot possibly understand the context of students to a fine-grained detail. We have a problem at the diagnosing level because we cannot get to diagnose all the important processes in education. And we have a problem on the informant and action level because we actually don't know how to interact well. So there was a lot of technical problems. Talking about this model over the last 5 years, you actually see that there is a large human aspect in this as well, because increasingly we're starting to realize that some things we just do not want to lose in education. We really want them to be human-human interaction. So I think shifting to a more pedagogical perspective, the main question really is, what is the main thing that we want to automate, and which tasks do we really want to keep in human hands? And that decision is a really tough one because it's not limited anymore by our technical possibilities. We can do this. The question is, do we actually want to do this? And what happens when we start doing it? And I think that is a difference from 5 years ago when we couldn't do it. So it's an interesting call and an interesting time for all of us, but it's a very hard decision to make about which things we do want to have AI do and which things we want to continue to do ourselves. So I think we need all of us to answer that.
So thanks everybody. We'll finish the second keynote session, and then we will have more workshops and parallel sessions starting from 3:50. See you guys around.